Welcome to this weekend edition of Daily Dose of Hebrew. We are going to begin today a series from 1 Samuel 3. It's a Samuel's call narrative. We will translate and discuss the verse as normal, but I want to take this series and focus in on the accents of the Hebrew Bible and show you how these can help with translation and sometimes even interpretation. So let's begin today by reading the Hebrew together, and then we'll translate it and look at some of the accent marks. Let's read together. Veha Nahar Shemuel Mesharet et Adonai lifnei Eli Udevar Adonai Haya Yakar Bayamim Hahem Ein Chazon Nifratz. And the whole translation for this verse then is, now the young man or boy, Samuel, was a server of the Lord, or we might say was serving the Lord before Eli. And the word of the Lord existed as precious. Most translations here are going to go with rare for yakar. So we would get the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no vision, one being spread about. And the end of this verse is a little tricky with this nifal participle here. The parsing is a nifal participle masculine singular absolute of the root paratz, pe resh tzade, to spread about. And in the passive nifal, we get the idea of something being spread about. In this case, it's the vision being spread about. Since participles are verbal adjectives, we can treat this one as somewhat of an appositional modifier for chazon, or vision. So we would get, there was no vision, one being spread about. The NRSV captures this participle well to say, visions were not widespread. Now, modern translations, most of them will smooth this out to say there was no frequent vision. If we go back to the beginning of the verse, let's look at the other verbs. Here we have mesharet, PL participle masculine singular absolute of the root sharat, shin resh tav. This is to serve or minister. And remember, the PL usually has the distinctive dagesh forte in the middle root letter, but here the dagesh is rejected because the middle root letter is a resh, and reshes reject dagesh fortes. You can confirm that this is what happened because our typical PL participle pattern for the vowels is a vocal schwa, patach, and then a dagesh forte in the R2. Here, though, we have the vocal schwa under the mem, and then a kametz. So we can confirm the dagesh forte has been rejected because we get what I call compensatory lengthening of the preceding vowel. And the next verb we have is after the athnach, haya. It's a standard call perfect 3ms of the root haya, hey yod hey. And the subject is the word of the Lord and is fronted in a nominal clause. The last verb we have already covered here. Remember, though, that the nifal perfect and the nifal participle look very similar as far as their vowel pointing pattern. However, notice that this verb has a long kametz as what I call the theme vowel underneath the R2. This is indicative of the participle, whereas the nifal perfect would have had a short patach as the thematic vowel. Now let's take a closer look at the accents for translating the rest of the verse. Let's first talk about the major accents we have here. The biggest disjunctive accent is the sof pasuk here. Now, the sof pasuk governs two additional major disjunctive accents, the saluk here and the athnach here. The saluk is what we call the near subordinate to the sof pasuk, and the athnach is what we call the remote or far subordinate accent. These two accents mark off the major two sections of the verse. The first break that I want to look at is at the athnach. So that gives us this section of the verse that we can begin with. One way that the accents help us with translation is that they demarcate sections of the verse. And we want to translate all of the words of the respective sections together. So here, we don't want anything from the athnach side being translated with the saluk side. In the athnach segment, we have additional breaks that we can make. Some accents are disjunctive, while others are conjunctive. You may refer to the bookmark from your BHS for a full list. This bookmark is arranged by disjunctive and conjunctive accents, but it is also listed in order of what they call maybe weight or amount of disjunct. The accents toward the top are what we call the heavier disjunctive accents. And these accents are the ones that will break the verse into segments. And the conjunctive accents typically will mark words in construct or words that should be read closely together, almost as a singular package. Let's take a closer look now at the Athnach segment here. From here, we want to break the verse even further. The next heaviest disjunctive accent in the Athnach segment is the tifka here. So even with our Athnach segment, we can further divide the verse with this yellow line. This now breaks our Athnach segment into a smaller segment that is translated together. The next major break within the tifka segment is the tabir here. The tabir marks off the explicit subject of the nominal clause, namely Samuel. Now, we have an even smaller segment of the verse, marked by the green line that gets translated together. The other accents here are all conjunctive. So we have the darga here, combining the young boy Samuel. Next, we have the merikah, combining the one serving with its object, the Lord. And finally, we have the munach, conjoining the construct lifnei with eli. Now that we have our segments, we can translate each segment together and get the flow of the verse. We don't want any piece of one segment to flow over into the other and cross over a disjunctive accent. So here we get, now the young boy Samuel was serving the Lord before Eli. Now, all of this may seem unnecessary, but we will see in verse 3 of 1 Samuel chapter 3, in a couple of weeks, we'll see how arranging the verse with accents can actually affect our interpretation or the exegesis of a verse too. Let's look now at the second half of 1 Samuel 3:1. In this half of the verse, our main disjunctive accent is the saluk here. The saluk always occurs on the word immediately preceding the sof pasuk, and so it doesn't carry a massive amount of weight. Even so, we typically call this the saluk segment, similarly to how we've just been talking about the Athnach segment. Like before, we can break this segment down into smaller groupings of words as well. The near subordinate accent of the saluk is the tifka again. The remote subordinate accent is the zakef katon, or what we call the small zakef. We now get this half verse divided into smaller segments. Let's add these lines like before to demarcate our segments. Here's the yellow one and the green one. Now, within the zakef segment, we can divide even further. The near subordinate of the zakef is the pashta, and the remote subordinate is the revia. If we continue adding to the dividing lines, the verse would look something like this. There's one red one and another red one. The remaining accents in this saluk segment are all conjunctive. Devar with the makef doesn't need a conjunctive accent necessarily, since it is read as one package anyway. The next conjunctive accent is the mapak here, combining haya and yakar. The munach, combining beyamim hahem, and the merikah, combining ein chazon. With all of this in place then, for the saluk segment, we can get the following translation. And the word of the Lord, this is the subject, existed in the status of rare in those days. The green line here marks a major break of the saluk segment, and causally and syntactically this makes sense. So we finish the verse then with, and there was no vision, one being spread about, or a frequent one. There was no frequent vision. Let's look at the whole verse together again now with the appropriate breaks. And once we put the whole verse together now, you can see how the accents can help us break a verse up into its parts. Now, very often, the accents follow fairly typical clausal and syntactical breaks. So then, at the very least, this can be helpful for breaking a verse down into its parts for translational purposes. Translate the words in their respective sections together and don't let them overlap past a disjunctive accent. Like I mentioned before, we will see some that are exegetically important too. While we don't want to say that the accents are inspired in any way, they are helpful for understanding the clausal and syntactical relationships of words in order to aid translation. So let's translate this whole verse together one final time. Now, the young boy Samuel was serving the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no vision, a widespread one. Or again, we may say, there was no widespread vision, or there was no frequent vision.